She was once Medusa, whose gaze could turn people to stone with just a look. But now she faced the Headless Horseman. Their prolonged battle remained unresolved. The reason they met here was because of a sacred sword hidden in this location. Just a day ago, Ichabod had inadvertently discovered a way to eliminate Moloch, involving a sacred sword capable of slaying all demons. Benjamin had once possessed this sword, but unable to wield its power, he had it sealed away. According to notes left by Benjamin, the place where the sword was sealed happened to be in the town of Sleepy Hollow. As soon as Abby and Ichabod arrived, the Headless Horseman, having received the same news, hurried to the scene, prompting them to quickly hide behind a nearby tree. However, it seemed the Headless Horseman's target was not them. He walked straight into a building, hiding. Abby followed quietly, just as the Headless Horseman raised his axe to dig. Abby accidentally knocked a brick in front of her. The noise immediately drew the Headless Horseman's attention. As he drew closer, suddenly Ichabod emerged from another side, prompting the Headless Horseman to pull the trigger. Ichabod quickly turned, drawing the Headless Horseman towards him, but soon found himself cornered. Fortunately, the rising sun emitted strong ultraviolet rays, causing the Headless Horseman's body to emit white smoke, forcing him to retreat on his white horse. Following this, Ichabod and Abby arrived at the spot where the Headless Horseman had been standing. On the ground, they indeed found a hidden door, leading down a staircase into a cave. The cave was filled with humanoid statues, each with a peculiar expression as if they had seen something terrifying. While they were puzzled, a creature resembling a snake appeared above them. At that moment, Ichabod recalled a terrifying myth. Without time to explain, he immediately took Abby and ran outside. Fortunately, they managed to close the door before the serpent creature could emerge. It turned out that the creature was Medusa from Greek mythology, whose gaze could curse anyone who looked into her eyes to turn into stone. With such a powerful creature guarding the sacred sword, Abby thought it impossible for anyone to retrieve the sword. But then she suddenly thought of the Headless Horseman. Since Medusa's curse only affects those who look into her eyes, the Headless Horseman could potentially confront her. Thus, they waited there until nightfall. For the first time, they hoped the Headless Horseman would appear soon. Abby's heart fluttered with excitement. If they could lure the Headless Horseman in front of Medusa, they could take the opportunity to sneak in and steal the sword. As they spoke, the Headless Horseman arrived. Ichabod and Abby pretended to be very scared and ran directly into the cave, with the Headless Horseman following without hesitation. The Headless Horseman raised his axe and chopped off the head of a statue, thoroughly drawing Medusa's attention. Silently, Medusa approached the Headless Horseman from behind. Meanwhile, Ichabod took out his phone to record the scene. While Medusa battled the Headless Horseman, Ichabod and Abby quickly entered a room deep within the cave. To their surprise, the room was filled with various swords, leaving Ichabod and Abby unsure of which to choose. Ichabod asked Abby to look for the real sacred sword while he went outside to buy time. At this moment, Medusa was still fighting with Headless Horseman, but she had searched for a long time but couldn't find Headless Horseman's head. Instead, her own head was even chopped off by Headless Horseman. Ichabod, seeing this, hurried to notify Abby when a familiar voice suddenly stopped him. The Headless Horseman transformed back into Abraham and approached, facing the man who had stolen his fiancée. Abraham was filled with endless rage, determined to settle things with Ichabod once and for all. Initially, their fight was evenly matched, but when Abraham mentioned Katrina, it completely enraged Ichabod, who kicked Abraham away. Seeing a shotgun fall to the ground, Abraham picked it up and aimed at Ichabod. At that moment, Abby still hadn't found the real sacred sword and had to randomly pull one out, causing all the swords before her to turn into snakes. Ichabod, who escaped back, was also confused when he saw the scene. Before they could understand what was happening, Abraham, shotgun in hand, chased after them. Just as Abraham was about to shoot and kill Ichabod, the sound of a shofar reached them, signaling that Moloch was summoning all the knights. Although Abraham desperately wanted to kill Ichabod then, he lowered his gun. The demon lord Moloch was about to be resurrected, and he wanted Ichabod to experience agony from hell. After saying this, Abraham left the scene. Ichabod's mind was confused by the successive blows, but Abby kept counseling Ichabod, which helped him to find himself gradually. Ichabod looked at the water tank in front of him and touched it, only to discover that it was not filled with water, but oil. Then they put their torches into it. As the oil burned off, a sword hilt appeared before them. Ichabod carefully drew the sacred sword, his heart filled with a firm belief in victory as he held the blade that could slay all demons.
We shall not witness the apocalypse on this night. Moloch shall not Rise.
3 days ago, he was an infant. 3 days later, he became the demonic Lord Moloch. To gain complete control of the world, Moloch prepared to merge the earthly realm with purgatory. But now, the most crucial task was to destroy the sacred sword in Ichabod's hands, for it was a threat to his life. At this time, Ichabod and Abby were also in search of Moloch. They first arrived at the Frederick estate, where they happened upon the Headless Horseman preparing to form a pact with Katrina. Seeing this, Ichabod drew the sacred sword and charged forward. With the weapon's power, the Headless Horseman was no match for Ichabod. Soon the two of them were able to decide the winner. Ichabod, holding the sacred sword, demanded the location of Moloch, but the Headless Horseman claimed that Ichabod wouldn't dare use the sword to kill him, as it would also claim his life. It turned out that the soul of whoever uses the sacred sword to take a life would also be consumed by it, which is why the sword had been sealed away. They were somewhat skeptical of what Abraham had told them, but Katrina saw the runes on the sword, and as a sorcerer, she felt a great power. Just in case, Ichabod locked up Headless Horseman. They began to research the sacred sword and found that its description matched what the Headless Horseman had said. The soul of the user would be scorched by fire and perish. Having finally obtained this powerful sacred sword, it seemed that defeating Moloch would require a sacrifice. As they struggled with the decision, Jenny suddenly thought of the former sheriff, Frank. Frank's soul had already been sold to Henry, so using the sacred sword would not harm him. Knowing they were going to battle Moloch, Frank did not hesitate to agree. Frank, holding the sacred sword, approached Abraham. The soulless Frank has no fear of the holy sword backfiring. Seeing this, the Headless Horseman had no choice but to reveal everything. Moloch intended to merge purgatory with the human realm, and the 4 white trees in the forest were key to the fusion. The first tree represented light, the second tree represented blood. When the third tree fell, Moloch's demon army would invade the human realm, and with the collapse of all 4 trees, the world would become a hellish purgatory. By now, Moloch had destroyed 3 of the white trees, and his army had crawled out from purgatory. To stop Moloch's plan, Ichabod and his group armed themselves and headed to the forest. But as soon as they arrived, they encountered the demon army, equipped with long-range firearms. During the firefight, Abby was accidentally shot in the shoulder, and Katrina quickly used magic to block the oncoming demons. Katrina told Jenny to take Abby and leave first. Meanwhile, Frank, wielding the sacred sword, easily defeated the lesser demons. After dealing with a demon in front of him, Frank saw the Horseman of War charging towards him on his horse. Frank met him head-on with the sacred sword, with the Horseman of War's body destroyed by the sacred sword. Henry, who controlled the Horseman of War, suffered severe backlash. Although Frank won the battle, he was wounded multiple times and ultimately succumbed to blood loss right there. At this point, Moloch's plan was still incomplete, and he commanded Henry to seize the sacred sword. Henry was also very afraid of the sword's power, but Moloch gave him no chance to argue, and Henry had to obey. When Henry arrived at a dilapidated church, Abby, holding the sacred sword, walked out from the side. Seeing only Abby there, Henry waved his hand and took control of her. Just as Henry bent down to pick up the sacred sword, Jenny suddenly appeared and shot him in the shoulder, but it did no harm to Henry's body, and Jenny was quickly subdued by Henry. Just as Henry took the sacred sword in his hand, Katrina chanted a spell, and suddenly the sword in his hand turned into an ordinary sword. Ichabod, holding the real sacred sword, placed it against Henry's neck. Faced with his own son who constantly opposed him, Ichabod was at a loss. Although Henry had sided with Moloch, Ichabod still believed there was a chance to save him. After a heartfelt plea from Ichabod, Henry seemed to have a change of heart, but just as Ichabod's group let their guard down, Henry suddenly snatched the sacred sword.
As an immortal, I can wield this with impunity. Faith, hope, and charity. The Holy Trinity has brought you to your knees again, Father. Come. Moloch is waiting.
Henry then led everyone to Moloch, whom he greatly respected as a demonic father. Henry had thought Moloch would reward him generously, but to his surprise, Moloch immediately ordered him to kill Katrina and declared that all the knights were merely puppets. Upon hearing this, Henry's heart instantly lost its light, and he looked back at his mother with a cold expression. Just as Henry raised the sacred sword to strike, Ichabod suddenly called out to him, offering to take Katrina's place.
Tell me of Abraham's sacrifice. Nikita. The story of a cruel and merciless God who designed a cruel and merciless world. Who could worship and deity who commands a man to sacrifice his own son. Those days have come to an end. True lesson of the story comes not from Abraham, but from Isaac. The chasm between father and son was never bridged. They never spoke again. And justly so. For any man willing to sacrifice his child should die. As should any god!
Thus, Moloch died by Henry's hand. When Ichabod and his companions awoke from unconsciousness, the scene was left with only a head that had not yet been fully consumed by fire. Since the demonic Lord Moloch was vanquished by Henry, no demons had appeared in Sleepy Hollow, but behind the calm always lurked greater threats. One day, as Ichabod and Abby were strolling outside, they suddenly heard strange noises coming from a nearby stable. Upon cautiously entering, they discovered 3 figures in black robes praying around a fire. Unexpectedly, they were demons from purgatory. At that moment, a man with wings flew in from outside and, facing the 3 demonic men, immediately threw the weapon in his hand. One of the demons disintegrated into dust upon contact with the weapon, realizing they were no match for the man. The remaining 2 demons quickly jumped into a fire pit and escaped the area. The man introduced himself to Ichabod and Abby as Orion, an angel from heaven, who had come to eradicate the escaped demons. It turned out that 200 years ago on the battlefield, Orion had been defeated by the Horseman of Death and was subsequently imprisoned in purgatory by Moloch. It was only a few months ago, after Moloch's death and the ensuing turmoil in purgatory, that he had managed to escape. The demons they had just encountered were also escapees. Constantly in search of a new master, Abby immediately thought of the Headless Horseman, as he still harbored evil power within him. Upon learning that they had captured the Headless Horseman, Orion stated that he could eliminate him, as his weapon was the nemesis of all demons. Without any doubt, Abby agreed immediately. When she and Orion arrived at the place where the Headless Horseman was detained, Katrina instantly recognized Orion and sensed his power. Knowing that Orion was there to eliminate the Headless Horseman, Katrina quickly went to the cell and told Abraham she had found a way to separate him from death. But now that an angel had come seeking vengeance, he must promise to stop killing during this time. Currently wanting to be free from death's bondage, Abraham agreed to Katrina without hesitation. When Ichabod and the others reached the cell, Abraham was already gone. Katrina had released him from the place. However, Katrina's actions had deeply divided them. To quickly find and eliminate the Headless Horseman, Abby contacted Jenny and Nick. They used an ancient bead to track him and soon located the Headless Horseman's hiding place. Abby then reconnected with Orion, planning to go alone with him to hunt the Headless Horseman. But en route, Abby suddenly received a call from Ichabod, who had found through biblical research that Orion was not as straightforward as he seemed. In past centuries, wherever great disasters occurred, Orion's presence could be noted. Ichabod felt that Orion's appearance this time also had a purpose. After hearing this, Abby informed Ichabod of their destination and then continued with Orion as if nothing was amiss. When they reached the Headless Horseman's hideout, Orion fully revealed his true intentions. Orion prepared to use his weapon to absorb the power of the Headless Horseman, then use this energy to conduct a judgment upon humanity. His sharp blade would cleanse all evil from the world. The Headless Horseman was just the first in Orion's plan. Next, he would drain Katrina's power, and once his own power was sufficient, he would dominate the world. Abby looked at Orion with a shocked look on her face. The man in front of her was undoubtedly the next Moloch. At that moment, the Headless Horseman was forging a new weapon. 2 demons chanted spells at the furnace, and the Headless Horseman threw a heap of scrap metal into it, soon forging a brand new battle axe. But just as the Headless Horseman was admiring his new weapon, Orion appeared behind him. Foes reunited, they immediately commenced a fierce battle, seeing that the Headless Horseman's power was about to be completely absorbed.
Can you feel that? My blade gathers your power for my use. Your death will burn bright, cauterizing this festering wound. Turn this area into a smoldering crater. End the evil that escaped purgatory.
Abby and Ichabod, who arrived just in time, decided to split up and act separately. Abby was tasked with distracting Orion, while Ichabod snuck behind to aid the Headless Horseman. Ichabod first pulled Orion's weapon out of the Headless Horseman, then raised his axe and shattered Orion's weapon into pieces. Without his weapon, Orion was no match for the Headless Horseman. Watching the glowing blade in his opponent's hand, Orion reluctantly spread his wings and fled the scene. Afterwards, the Headless Horseman told Ichabod and his group that he could try to separate from death, but during this time, he would not submit to anyone's constraints.